Good morning and welcome to Blain's Morning Porridge. It's February 25th, 2026. What is the US yield curve really telling us? Let's start with a quote, and since it was the State of the Union address last night in the US, I have chosen something from a previous President, Herbert Hoover. When there is a lack of honour in government, the morals of the whole people are poisoned. Does the steepness of the US yield curve tell us the US economy is about to boom, or is inflation about to sink the Treasury markets? To figure out which, you need to interrogate the witnesses and look at what the evidence is telling us. It's all a bit CSI. And my ambition is to keep learning new stuff, like this morning's quote from Herbert Hoover. And one of the things I enjoy most is sharing my experience of how markets work in practice. Aside from my careless Desmond, a Tutu, in economics, my only qualifications to do so are gleaned from surviving 40 years in the financial markets. But my great delight is my honorary professorship at the Edinburgh Business School, which I suspect they might have given me because they felt I deserved a B+ for effort. But I do have a few I don't really have any academic chops as a great thinker or as a theoretical economist. All I do is know a little bit about markets, and I do think that markets, economics and politics make a curious kind of sense, and if you dig deep enough inside yourself, it's even possible to explain them and figure them out. So yesterday I was delighted when I had the great pleasure to give a guest lecture to the bond markets to a classroom of American PhD students at Brown University in New England, which I did via Zoom. They are taking a class on the international political economy of global finance. It's a fascinating course run by my great chum, fellow Scot and a genuine academic, Professor Mark Blythe. Mark is a guy who takes deep interest in how complex things work. He picks them apart and asks difficult questions like, why? And he's now applying that intellectual curiosity to take students deep into the foundations, architecture and plumbing of international finance. Now, I've looked at the syllabus, and if I had the time, I'd take the course myself because it's good to see ourselves as others see us and wonder if there might be better ways to think about the world and how to action it. And the fact that I got asked a lash of questions following my lecture was an added bonus. One of the student questions clarified part of my own thinking on bond markets, and I'd like to share it as it sort of explains one of the causal linkages between politics and markets. A student asked me about what the yield curve is really telling us, and she was wondering if a steep yield curve is a signal of high expectations for an economy in rude health, as the steep yield curve suggests growth, and that's because of its attendant inflationary pressures. Now, that's very much an equity read on bond markets. Stock pickers tend to be optimists, looking for upside, joy, sweetness and light, and we cite an inverse yield curve as an irrefutable signal that a recession is imminent for the same reasons, that if inflation in the future is lowering, that's because the economy is going to slow, and if the inflation is going to rise, it's because the economy is going to boom, which is what people are reading just now. But bond markets are very different to equity markets. Bond markets are dour, very Scottish. We find downside in a ray of sunshine. We see a steep yield curve as expressing an expectation of rising inflation for which bond market investors demand a premium. Bond markets care about prompt repayment of principal and interest and fear one thing and one thing only, inflation. They fear what causes it. The trick is therefore to figure out what the yield curve is telling us about inflation by collating the evidence around it. What are the bodies on the floor and the ransacked debris in the room telling us about the real economic outlook? Does it mean a hot economy and an inflationary boom as companies make money, innovate new technology, and consumers come together to spend more? Or does it indicate an inflationary bust triggered by bad policies likely to generate inflation, or even a stagflationary bust as bad policies lead not only to inflation but also recession? Which naturally brings us to the United States of America and last night's State of the Union rant by President Trump and my theory of the virtuous sovereign trinity. Now, my virtuous sovereign trinity theory simply states that an economy with a stable currency, a sustainable bond market, and political competency will tend to do fine. Simple as. And I quote examples of the Black Tuesday sterling rout in 1992, which was engineered by a young Scotty Besant, who is now US Treasury Secretary, who was then working for George Soros. Or that demonstrates what a destabilized currency can do to an economy. Or we have the example of Liz the Lettuce Truss unraveling the UK's reputation for political competency in 2022 when she blithely announced a massive spend more tax less budget which set off a calamitous slide in gilts, triggering margin calls on levered trades that threatened to end the 320-year-old gilt market in a whoosh of single foolish budget talk. There is a fantastic website, www.ustreasuryyieldcurve.com, if you want to analyse the US yield curve without a Bloomberg. But let's look at the evidence currently in the US economy. What have we got? Well, pick through the tariff mayhem, the rising healthcare costs that will be imposed upon the lowest in society, the fears about AI replacing everyone's jobs, rising income inequality, and broken global supply chains and relationships, plus a potential war in Iran, and it's all the usual stuff. But what does it all really mean for the future? Well, let's start off with the witnesses. And there is a great piece in the Washington Post this morning, a poll of 2,300 Americans asking them the best and worst things Trump has done since his second inauguration. It highlights some key metrics for markets to consider when placing their bets. 39% of US voters approve of Trump's performance as president. 80% of these cite his handling of immigration through deportations and ICE as the best thing he's doing. 45% of Trump supporters think he's doing a great job in the economy, and 15% of them think the big, beautiful tax cutting deal was a great thing, while 14% think tariffs will save America. Trump supporters coalesce around the border issue, immigration, and security. Now, 60% of US voters disapprove of Trump, but they're not united by any one factor in the way that Trump supporters are. Only 57% of them think the deportation and border issues are a bad thing. 33% think the economy is in a mess, and 29% of them think that is because of the tariffs. 22% of them cite the endemic corruption around Trump, hence my quote from Herbert Hoover this morning, his violation of the Constitution and the politicization of the justice system. 17% are deeply unhappy about Trump's destruction of America's foreign relationships, while 13% think the Epstein files will prove a massive issue for the US. That's very interesting. There's lots of reasons for US citizens to feel concerned, but the actual gaps between pro and anti in immigration and the economy are quite small. On immigration, 36% of Americans are unhappy, while 32% think it's a good thing. What Trump's doing, I mean. On the economy, 20% of Americans are fearful, while 18% think Trump's doing a marvelous job. These are pretty thin margins. The other evidence, though, of whether inflation is due to a coming inflationary boom or bad policy triggering inflation is kind of mixed. Concerns on Fed independence and a potential stock market bust or a private credit meltdown are balanced by the rosy outlooks about rising corporate credit and profits, lower rates triggering a housing recovery, and the potential gains in productivity from AI. On the other hand, you have over 50% of Americans concerned, 10% of them deeply concerned, that AI is going to cost them their jobs. However, as a very dour Scot and bond market guy, what do I really think? Well, I see three problems in the States just now. The first is currency stability, the end of the dollar's exorbitant privilege as the world starts trading between itself rather than using dollars, and that means fewer dollars in banks being invested in treasuries and a long-term weakening of the dollar, which will be inflationary. The Treasury market has to refund about 30% of its 38 trillion outstanding for the next couple of years, as in global interest rates and the market for treasuries is increasingly tested. Trump offends many, and the risks around hegemonic change are rising, all of which are bad for treasury demand. And then there is the issue of political competency. Now, last night, Trump kept steady and made it through the State of the Union rant without losing it. But how well he is likely to react to a no-see-him shock, maybe in Iran or in the midterm elections, is unknown. The chance of an unconstrained Trump blow-off could well tip the Treasury market, especially if we have a no-see-him that triggers another inflationary shock in oil and energy prices, which is a possibility. All of which is telling me that the current steep US curve is factoring in bad policies resulting in inflation more than an economic boom. Anyway, out of time, I got to go off and do my day job. You can find the Morning Porridge on www.morningporridge.com, and if you sign up, you'll get it delivered fresh to your inbox every morning. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I've got to run, and I'll be back, I hope, tomorrow. There will be no porridge next week, as I will be back on the slopes. Thank you very much for your time. Cheers.